Dr. Fadde is joining us online.
And I want to just express my appreciation for everybody making the accommodation for those of us that aren't able to join the wonderful group for the week there. So what I want to talk about is this culture war, as I perceive it, between information processing and ecological dynamics. And many of you might say, well, gee, I'm not aware of any culture war, but it's likely that if you're in this interested in this area, that in fact you are involved in that in some way. Now, as an academic and also an entrepreneur in trying to put those two things together, I find myself right in the middle of that culture war, and it's an interesting place for perspective. Now, to protect myself and you from the straw man sort of pull there, I'm going to reference an article just out here, March of 24, that really puts this together in a nice way, and it's an open source article, and it really focuses on the adaptable coach. Really focuses on the coach, although with a critical academic review, but with the eye toward practical implications and looking at traditional versus constraints-led approaches. Now, anybody with an education research background certainly recognizes traditional approach, usually as something of a straw man argument. And constraints-led, I'm not going to particularly go into. It's a really deep and wonderful thing to explore it's its own topic. The ecological dynamics folks tend to kind of claim it, and I'm not sure if that's legitimate or not, but we'll see. So the authors here, Lindsay and Spittle, do a really nice framework, and they talk about representation-based approaches, and you say, well, now hold it. That's different than information-based or the traditional. No, this is what they mean by the traditional approach and ecological approaches. But it's important that it's an and not an or between those. Now, what I'm particularly interested in dealing with highly ballistic and reactive sports is the perception action link. How can we couple or decouple this perception action link, and what are the implications for practice? So as we look at that a little more carefully, then we see the representation-based approach as treating perception as an indirect process, where sensory information is perceived and recognized using internal memory representations. That is pattern recognition, what Pam talked about as cue identification and recognition. Whereas the ecological approach treats perception in such a way that sensory information in the environment is sufficient for movement. Now we're talking about, within this context, perception and action that take place in less than a second, actually in less than half a second. So those are really different views on that, and bringing it really more in-house to things that all the earlier talks have been about, come up so many times during the week, the recognition primed decision-making model, which I first applied to this, to the area of like baseball pitch recognition back in about 15 years ago, recognizing that the theory really generates out of time frames that certainly have urgency, but usually a couple of minutes or at least a couple of seconds, as opposed to a portion of a second. So I was a little nervous about that, but I actually got an email from Gary saying, sounds good. So we went forward from there. So the RPD is still recognizing that there is a recognition, perception, cognition, action together, some kind of relationship, even if it's not serial or sequential, as opposed to the direct perception. And when we're talking about something happening in less than a second, it certainly appears to be direct perception. So that's the model of perception. But then what are the implications for practice? And here we see the representation-based approach, looking at task complexity as being reduced by breaking, and putting that in quotation marks may show off the little bit of a political bent of the authors, but we're letting go on that. They're trying hard. Breaking the skill into small chunks, task decomposition, versus ecological approaches that favor the task remaining whole, although simplified, to retain perception action coupling. Now, for those of us who'd have any kind of background in or belief in behavioral learning, that sounds like the difference between chaining and shaping, maybe between natural learning and artificial but highly efficient training. Ultimately, it comes down to part task versus whole task, part task versus whole task in a perception action coupling. Can we part task perception action one? Now, this has become a real point of contention in Major League Baseball, US, this season, because the pitchers are just so much ahead. And so, they're throwing 100 miles an hour. That's the first pitch. He's not throwing two at a time, but he's throwing the 100-mile-an-hour fastball at the top of the zone, 160 kilometers per hour, and tunneling it with a sharp slider that breaks out of the same location and goes to an entirely different area. This is ridiculously difficult to hit. So how can we get some help to the batters, to the hitters, in responding to this, especially as we would apply technology to that? So, here's a distinctly part task approach. It's just the perception of the ball coming out and the action of hitting it, the pitching machine. This one then that uses wheels to be able to simulate every pitch. And then about 12 years ago, we started putting a video pitching machine. There's a machine behind that projection screen that's throwing the ball out in the same way. And here's the most modern iteration of this. And this looks similar, but it's not. This is the state of the art. That's a highly technical machine back there that can throw any of those wicked pitches. And that's tonight's pitcher that's showing that. So major leaguers are using that down in the tunnel before the game. Yeah, another option is virtual reality, an immersive one where, again, you can model the actual pitches thrown. You get natural feedback with the ball flight of a hit ball, and also artificial feedback. Here, an occlusion method where they're cutting it off and saying, "Oh, guess the pitch. That's a curveball." And that's the method that I work with. So this could be on an iPad or a television or even a phone, where you see the cutoff pitch. That's the occluded pitch. That comes from the research laboratory as far back as the early 80s. And can we teach them to hear the batter guess fastball strike and know it was the other? And we can increase the ecological fidelity by attaching a response to that, a physical response, which is shown to actually improve the perceptual part of it, although it's not actually a true simulation, but it does enter the decision into that. So the question, again, back to that part task versus whole task, is, and this is something that's out there on the field now for basic research. What about these young fellas who are looking at the perception only in this room with their bat next to them, and they're going to walk through that door into the cage right here, where they're going, right up here, where they're going to face the pitching machine? So are the perception and the action that close enough together to have an impact? Do they need to be simultaneous? Can we gain the efficiencies of part task, recognition primed type approaches? Or do we really need to be going all in on ecological approaches? So that's what I mean, within the culture war. And it's not a war we have to win, but by being aware of both ends of the continuum, it helps us think creatively about how we can handle these perceiving dynamic patterns, as I think that was Robert who just said that, in a really extreme way.
Thank you so much. We have a question from Jamie Taylor.
Hi, Peter. Thank you for that. And I suppose I would absolutely describe it as a culture war, and I found myself right in the middle of it quite a lot in the last few years. It's not often you get people emailing the president of a university saying that they should sack you because somebody didn't like what you wrote in a paper. I'm just curious about this because I absolutely see the difference between indirect and direct perception. I do wonder whether that has then been conflated with pedagogy. and that because I don't see many more representational based accounts, which I do think go beyond information processing accounts, arguing for low fidelity practice as being offering transfer. So my question is, to what extent are we dealing with something that is a comparison or an artificial dualism and a straw personing of the other side here?
Right. And a perspective that I have on this is the, and this comes through clearly with the decision games and everything else, is that there's something to be said for the lowest necessary fidelity. You know, what is the lowest effective dose? And to me, the higher effective dose is the one that carries the burden of proof. Unfortunately, it usually flips around on that. So, you know, I admire all of our approaches that are there, because they're not only lower fidelity, but they're lower cognitive load. And as you could see in this particular performance that we're looking at, there's tremendous cognitive, emotional load. I mean, that's a rock coming at you at 160 kilometers per hour that moves as it's coming. And so, yeah, I think we gain from that. I don't know if I've lost contact with your question on that. I think that there is a dichotomy, certainly. I think that there's such a in the simulation area, there's such a natural pull to more real equals more learning. And we're many of us here are trying to look at, even looking at the CTA and the kind of things that those ball players say when they're trying to deal with that pitch that's coming in faster than they're used to. They might say, oh, they tell their teammate coming back, you need to get on top of his fastball. You need to get on top of it. You need to hit the top of the ball. Well, they don't want to hit the top of the ball. They're telling them, if you operationalize it, you need to swing over it. So we need to be teaching people the perceptual discipline to swing over your target. Your eyes are going to give you a target. Your eyes are going to give you the perception of dynamic pattern. Your eyes are going to give that to you, especially these extremely skilled ball players. But the skill of the opposition forces you to actually adjust to that. My eyes tell me X, Y, I'm going to swing X plus 1, Y plus 2.
Well, I just wanted to thank everyone who participated in this panel. Thank you very much again to everyone who participated.